what is real abstraction and why is it important to understand. So the fundamental notion of real abstraction is that there the kind of the Kantian figure of an individual cognizing mind is comes from is a reflection of the real abstraction brought together by the invention of coinage, as put by Son Rethel, that the abstractness operating in exchange and reflected in value does nevertheless find an identical expression in the abstract intellect, so that the true historical explanation of the consciousness and cognitive faculties of civilized man, of man's seemingly unique ability amongst animals to have this power of abstraction, that the original source is commodity exchange. But there's this kind of what I want to connect this to is this notion that intellectual labor, which includes abstraction, is claimed by artificial intelligence to find itself effectively automated and done by machines. And so I think we really have a kind of troublesome notion in front of us. Next. So the question is, to some extent, the question is really, what is abstraction and is it real? If abstraction is only kind of a downstream and subsidiary notion that's contingent on the invention of an external artifact like currency, in terms of philosophy, you could say, is abstraction just really an epiphenomenon? Is it a subjective illusion? Is it to some extent not real? Does it not track or justify or cohere with the real objects or real world? And or is it kind of the reverse, what you would call scientific realism? Is there abstraction inherent in the world itself? And what is it that this abstraction captures in the world and effectively makes it work on not purely an epistemological level, because AI operates to a large extent outside of how we would traditionally conceive of making claims epistemologically. But what makes it work? Is it working because there's some ontological, some truth about reality that abstraction is capturing? Next. So what I'm going to argue is a notion that comes from Daniel Dennett, who was a not particularly Marxist philosopher that was alive. That was alive for a very long time and died effectively earlier this year. And he has a wonderful paper called Real Patterns, where he's trying to understand on an analytic level, not historical level, what abstraction is. So he defines abstraction in kind of contrast to randomness. So Dan Dennett, kind of based on the relatively well-known work of Kolmogorov information theory and Chaitin, says randomness is a series of dots or numbers that is random if and only if the information required to describe or transmit the series is incompressible. So it's random if you can't, in some extent, make it shorter, describe it on another level. And thus a real pattern exists in some data, and he conceives of the world as data, which is, of course, a bit problematic, but let's just go with it for now. He says, if there's a description of the data that is more efficient than randomness, whether or not anyone actually knows what that description is, can concoct it, basically. And this lays an argument that there are these kinds of regularities, which can also be thought about as stabilities, these patterns that are therefore established at these higher level of abstractions. So the argument from Daniel Dennett, to summarize, is that there's a real world out there. It's kind of a scientific realist, and that abstractions are simply kind of compressions of this world, ways to think about this world efficiently, um, that inhere to some extent in the world and in our kind of, again, this is a kind of unreconstructed scientific realistic view. Our powers of abstraction allows to capture these abstractions, not all of them, but some of them. Those abstractions which are at least evolutionarily or historically useful for us, and that so Dan Dennett claims that there are real patterns and real abstract out there, and that abstraction works inherently by kind of capturing these. And I guess the question is, how did we get those patterns, these cognitive facilities develop? And this is where, next slide, this is where I think Sonrethel actually goes beyond the limits of the kind of analytic philosophy and scientific realism, insofar as he argues that the real abstraction operating exchanges engenders this kind of ideal abstraction, which is basic to Greek philosophy, modern science, and in particular for Sonrethel, the kind of break of mathematics. And what I'm going to argue is that there's a whole, Sonrethel had this really fascinating hypothesis, but at the time he had the hypothesis, people really didn't have any historical evidence or anthropological, archaeological evidence of how cognition developed. Now we actually have some. It's in this kind of relatively new field of cognitive archaeology. And in cognitive archaeology, the effective, I'll just try to, this is Göbel Tepe, which is, at least from 10,000 BC, so 12,000 years ago. And we see in structures which are much older than we thought, kind of abstract geometric shapes, matriarchal mother statues, self-representation. And so it's clear that there's been this kind of underlying power abstraction, which is an evolutionary breakthrough, is quite old. And the closest explanation, it's still very much up in the air, that people have, is that there was certain an explosion of the neocortex, which is some part of our brain, is related on some level to our cognitive faculties of abstraction. And this happened after the development of walking by Homo erectus, as this freed the hands of humans for the development of technology over 2 million years ago. Next slide. And so from this kind of neocortex explosion of neural connectivity, which is again not purely in the head, but related to the freeing of the hands, which is a point also noted by Friedrich Engels in his Dialectics of Nature. How is it that we became tool using creatures, and that and we saw an explosion of abstraction related to our use of tools, and also our use of voice, right? So our larynx kind of came down, and that there were geometric representations and tools, made over 100,000 years ago. We have really good evidence of this in Africa, and we have evidence. We have much more evidence of how money developed. So you had geometric designs and tools 100,000 years ago, and about 9 to 10,000 years ago, you had development of tallies, which were again not abstract in the sense of mathematics, but some lower level of abstraction where you could basically count the amount of commodities you had and put them on a clay token represented by either lines or dots. And these could be sealed, which were quite useful in this sort of clay token form in Mesopotamia. And these eventually became more and more generic. You had more and more kind of pictographic signs got replaced by, again, these patterns of lines and dots representing, for example, how many cows or how many copper ingots Ir-Nasir had, so forth and so on. And this kind of was the background of development of writing and abstract numerals. So on some level, the claim for cognitive archaeology is that Sonrethel is right. Writing was not originally developed necessarily for poetic or spiritual practices. I mean, there was obviously that was a component, but you actually look at the development written language, a lot of it was effectively accounting. It was related to commodity exchange. These large, often networks that spanned from ancient Mesopotamia all the way into ancient China and all the way into the copper mines of in Britain. So you had these huge trade networks, and these trade networks were based on commodity exchange, and this fueled the development of writing and accounting. And so this is, I think, next slide. This led to the increased focus on counting and numerization, and this led to the unification. And particularly, I think Sanrafo probably underestimates the role of ancient Babylon, the invention of, for example, the unification of various different types of numbers, integers, reals. And then, of course, it really did explode. And I think this is where Sanrafo is probably right. With the invention of the stater in Lydia, was simultaneous with the invention of a lot of abstract philosophy, and that it does seem to be that the pursuit of mathematics for its own sake, rather than simply counting and accounting and trading, was somewhat unique to ancient Greece. But you have to step back and take it as part of a kind of larger historical and cognitive evolution. Next slide. Sorry. And I think the best way to think about it is actually coming from a theory called cognitive extension, which basically says, I think, and this is quite congruent with Marx, that the mind is not only in the head, the mind is co-constituted by feedback loops between us as humans and our what appears to be external artifacts, that we internalize these artifacts. And so we internalize our digits, right? Our hand. This led to numerals. We re-externalize, right? It's very dialectical on this level. These same tallies and numerals across external media. And this led to a spiraling feedback loop or dialectic, which then gave birth to development of an more and more absolute notions of abstractions. So the image of abstraction is not based in the head or the mind of a cognitive faculty of an individual, but comes from the interactions of the individual with their cognitive niche, with their larger environment, including all the social forces of commodity exchange. Next. So on that level, I think Sanrethel is right. And so Sanrethel is, I think, not a particularly dialectical thinker. He kind of, it's a remarkably short and brilliant book where he kind of says, okay, the origin of abstraction is based on the invention of coinage, and thus the transcendental subject, epistemological subject kind of comes from this historically. And that's true. But Bernard Stiegler, who was my postdoctoral advisor, he has a critique of Sanrethel, which I think he gave in China, in Nanjing originally, where he says Sanrethel ignores the conditions upon which the general equivalent appears, and such that the general equivalent abstraction stems from written numerization, which themselves presuppose the appearance of writing. So I think Stiegler is right, although he's maybe a bit cruel to Sanrethel there, but that it is not that you have to tell a much wider dialectical story about how abstraction developed historically, which at the time Sanrethel really didn't have. He was based on Thompson and other folks. He didn't have the amount of archaeological evidence that we have today. And that real abstraction is actually a weaker notion, that what we know about historically, that was co-constituted by feedback loops between humanity and their external environments. And this both led to the invention of currency, and then the invention of currency then accelerated that feedback loop, helping give birth to philosophy and mathematics and science and so forth and so forth. And so that there is no such thing as a kind of a priori Kantian power or schema of abstraction. Next. And this leads us to artificial intelligence. It's quite a leap, but it's not, it's on some level fairly simple. That artificial intelligence is a kind of algorithm, right, applied to digital data, which is claimed to automate the intellectual labor of abstraction, once thought to be the exclusive province of humanity. And I'm not going to go into Max Tegmark and Kurzweil and these other, and there was a very excellent talk in the beginning of the session about are we approaching a singularity? Are we going to have artificial general intelligence, which is problematic from a Marxist standpoint? Obviously, it kind of they sort of claim machines really do produce value, not just labor. Or machines are very downstream, let's say, of labor historically. These kind of imagined AGI machines. But let's just kind of look again at the history of artificial intelligence. Next slide. So if you look at artificial intelligence, um, I think you can map it somewhat. This is a bit tentative, to the kind of mapping of the social synthesis put forward in the second part of Sonrethel's book on real abstraction. So early computing in the 50s and 70s was primarily directly ran by the government. This is where the term artificial intelligence was invented as an R&D project in the 1950s. This claim that the powers of abstraction, which we've historically developed over this long evolutionary period, it's something that we could understand such enough in such a way that we can have a machine that does it. And then this was primarily imagined to be used for military and government purposes. Sonrethel was aware of some of this early work. He actually mentions in his book the automation of counting and numerizations done by what's called Hollerith machines, which were the census tabulation machines invented by Hollerith, which led to IBM. And then this was based on a lordship and bondage model. So this means the government owned the computers, and you would kind of work on them for government approved tasks, sometimes including basic scientific research and sometimes including just pure military research. But what happened in the 70s and 90s in the United States just kind of, I think, gave the US a kind of leap ahead of at least other countries in terms of the development of artificial intelligence, what was called hacking and the personal computing revolution. So what happened is the students that were kind of working on these computers, they started imagining they would like to have one at home. They would like to be able to work on it without interfering with other people. This event led to the invention of time sharing, the invention of personal computers. It led to this spread of computers that were just thrown out of universities, and they were then, some of the older models were taken home, put into community centers like Community Resource in San Francisco. They were, and that you had this kind of artisanal gold guild culture where people really these students who were fanatics about computers developed free and open source software, developed personal computers as a way to originally they imagined empowering people, giving people these access to these new capabilities. And they didn't do so within an initially a capitalist point of view. They weren't imagining selling the computers. The computers were too expensive, too complex. They imagined giving them to people. People would run them collectively. And then with the invention of personal computing and the invention of proprietary software, which again came after the original software, which was mostly free and open source, it didn't really have an owner. This led to the insertion of computerization within the dynamics of capitalism, which led to, of course, Microsoft, Apple, and eventually now the rise of platforms, which enclose more and more data. Obviously Google, Amazon, and I'm sure there's various equivalents in China. And this is a sort of what I would say these data enclosures are actually symptomatic of monopoly capitalism. So they're moving from a kind of free market capitalism, at least in the beginning of the computer revolution, coming out of this corruption of, let's say, the artisanal and guild culture and into this kind of monopoly form. Next. And this is important. Next slide, Conrad. Maybe back one really quickly. This is important to understand what ChatGPT and LLMs actually are. So they don't have, unlike the initial realm of artificial intelligence, they don't have a priori abstract categories. They are effectively attempting to detect these seemingly preconceptual real patterns that do not clearly map to any abstract category of human psychology or science. And how do they do this? Is this is their claim, they take data, big data could be, but in particular for ChatGPT, all of the the linguistic data on the web and put this within a language model, essentially a unstructured model, and they kind of build that structure up and then use that structure to generate new patterns. That's what allows them to do create deep fakes or highly realistic writing. But what's happening on the level of kind of a Marxist theory is that they're reifying our social and linguistic commons into a proprietary AI model based on this huge influx of money and that needed to do the high power computing for the training based on various monopoly capitals. So next slide. So this is what a neural next slide, Conrad. This is what a neural network looks like. I'm sure you've seen it, but again, it's not particularly. There's a bare minimum of structure in there, and right now the main focus of R&D in this space and is to how we can make it less and less structured, have more and more of the structure determined by and the shape of the model determined by the data itself, where inputs go in, the quote unquote real patterns or abstractions are discovered by the hidden layers, and then the output kind of outputs either, the predictions, the classifications, generates the data based on these kind of abstract patterns, which are detected directly in the data. Next. So 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 this is super interesting on two levels. First thing, I think let's think about what's going on socially. So what Sonrethel said is that we had this great separation, which is not predicted too well in Marx's original work, where intellectual labor is kind of bifurcated from manual labor due to exchange society and becomes a kind of special demand for technocratic class rule, the head controlling the hand, as Sonrethel puts it. And this is also predicted by other thinkers before Sonrethel, particularly Bogdanov, where he says, well, capitalists introduce new technology, but they become increasingly separated from it, and thus, as Bernard Stiegler would put it, proletarianized. And what's happening now with artificial intelligence is that this power of mathematical, this power of abstraction, this power of mathematics, this kind of specialized, let's say, language of intellectual labor is itself becoming automatable. This is the claim, and thus proletarianized. That the capital themselves are going to lose their ability to do it and give more and more of it to machines because the machines are more efficient, can be ran in parallel, have lower labor costs, so forth and so on. Next. And but I think it's also important to say that artificial intelligence can help us answer the original question of whether abstraction itself is capitalist. Is it dependent on this kind of historical invention of currency? And Sonrethel argues very effectively that real abstraction does not mean that the abstract categories of science are false. To quote Sonrethel, physics has nothing to do with the exploitation of labor by capital. Its findings are valid irrespective of any particular production relationship. And that a post-capitalist science, a socialist science, let's say, would not single out objects as isolates, which are totally alienated from the qualitative realities of first nature, but would view things holistically within a larger historical unfolding. Next slide. And this was originally a vision that abstraction and cognition and intellectual labor is not just something which should be proletarianized, available only to capitalist classes, but is actually two things. A, it's the right way to do science. That science itself should be based on social understanding of social relationships, right, which includes notions of real abstraction, and that should be put in the hands of all people, not just a capitalist class controlling some monopoly control over machines of some sort. And then this led actually to the invention of notions of feedback and cybernetics by Lenin's old compatriot and rival, and eventually one of the founders of the Russian Bolshevik Party, Bogdanov, who argued that what was really needed to create a socialist world, which was not capable of being done by capitalism, was a universal organization science because the old bourgeois could only stand parts of their world, the parts of the machinery they were running, the parts of capitalism they were interested in, and we needed to understand the whole world and take into account the social basis of physiological processes of the brain, psychological phenomenons, our consciousness, our experience, and their historical and social character. Next, how it came to being. And this, I think, is important. This is incredibly important that effectively consciousness is something which is impossible to be explained. It still resists cognitive science. And Bloch, Husserlian phenomenology, Chalmers calls it the hard problem of consciousness. And they basically, and the reason I think is because they misunderstand the problem of consciousness. That consciousness and abstraction, these cognitive facilities, are not based in the head of an individual. They come from the world. They come from a particular historical trajectory. And the main thing that neural networks show us, they detect these patterns that we humans are efficiently sometimes not able to detect, even with the best tools of science. And that these patterns might and often are, by the fact that they kind of work well, real, that there are real patterns. There are ontologically real patterns, but these patterns are not out there in the world necessarily, separated from us, but they're part of a greater notion of, I think, what Caron called worlding or world making that we engage in together. And then thus the invention of abstraction and also consciousness comes precisely through the historical interaction of embodied individuals within a society, evolving historically over in time through greater and greater exteriorization and cognitive extension. And it happens through, again, these feedback loops that we discussed earlier in terms of cognitive archaeology, that we are constantly, for lack of a better word, exteriorizing more and more digital data, often with the help of artificial intelligence programs, and that this exteriorization is then re-interiorized. And this leads to us to be able to have new kinds of grasp or hold upon the world via these new kind of tools for thinking, these new concepts, these new abstractions that we're getting. And thus, the invention of currency is just one important, but one step on this larger path. And the invention of Chat GPT and LLMs are another step on this path. But rather than view these things as outside of us, as reified, taking these, they're actually, everything from the invention of currency to the invention of Chat GPT and artificial intelligence via, these are all reifications. When we think of them as separate from ourselves, they're reifications of our fundamental, our own social relationships. And these social relationships have a history and therefore can be thought of differently and guided differently. Next. And this is why I just want to say that this is the importance. So whether or not you agree with Sohn-Rethel, he reflects, Fred Jameson. I'd just like to dedicate this talk to him since he was such a wonderful mentor. And he unfortunately also died this year, the same year as Daniel Dennett. Fred Jameson's, what he said the maximum Marxism was, which was to always historicize. And Sohn-Rethel says this himself. He says, when our academic opponents ask what we know of social existence, which we oppose to this notion of a bourgeois individual with their inner subjective consciousness, with their faculties of abstraction, Sohn-Rethel claims that our answer would be, we know of it as little as you do, but we know how to find out. And the way to discover is to trace the genetical or origin of any current concept over history to discover the standards of it. And that's what I've tried to do a bit in this essay, to kind of take in some newer historical data, some newer thinking around artificial intelligence, and say that these, again, they're historical concepts. They're real concepts. There's something real there. They're not subjective purely, but they're also not purely objective. They're not beyond us, that we need to get rid of this subjective and objective divide and think about things in a totalizing fashion. And that is the task of critical theory. And that's the task that Sonrethel has given us to apply critical theory to not just history, to not just politics, but to cognition and to abstraction and to even consciousness. And by using the methodology of dialectics, which we can think about now, I think, using more modern tools such as cognitive extension, exteriorization, interiorization, we can understand how we created this technology and therefore how we can harness it better. I think that will be a large topic about tomorrow on the subject of ecology. So that's it. Thanks a lot.